So I finally wanted to make a video that basically goes over this car in more detail and in depth, because you guys I'm sure had a lot of questions about it and I've never really answered anything. You'll notice that the fender is off here and the bumper is off, and I did that just because I wanted to show you guys a little more in detail. These body parts were damaged at the end of last season. Ran over something slick, racing, it happens. Slid off, damaged the front fender, rear fender, cracked the front bumper. So right now I have those pieces off and they're getting repaired and actually ready to go back on now. So here's under the hood. This right here is carbon fiber ducting, which is the exit for the cooling air. There's a lot of work that I put into my chassis and anything that's going to be raced for heat management. And a 4-rotor, when done properly, really doesn't produce massive coolant temperature, but it does put out a whole bunch of oil temperature. That's something that not a lot of guys focus on using either stock size coolers or moderate size C-Trabs or Mocals or whatever they choose to use. But you really got to scale up a 4-rotor on the oil cooling, as I've learned. These oil coolers are ultra huge. This is a 55-row oil cooler. Now this is the advantage of having the bodywork off so you can really see it. My headlights are just false lids. They're not real, but I like the look of the pop-up, so I kept them without going to a flush light. I'm probably going to integrate bumper lights again so I can run, maybe some night races if that ever comes around. But everything's fully ducted. You notice that the inlet is smaller than the exit. And you always want to maintain that relationship. And that changes as the predominance of speed that you're going to see with the car that you're using. So a NASCAR that's always at 180 to 200 miles an hour is going to have extremely small front end openings because there's so much pressure at those speeds. You're trying to reduce the amount of drag as much as possible. With high rate of speed comes massive amounts of volume. So you can really shrink it down because you have all that pressure and still get plenty of flow through the radiator and heat exchangers. Now on this one, I'm getting up to 150, maybe 160 at the most, and that's only for a brief period of time. If you do an average speed around most tracks, you're probably in the 100-mile-an-hour range, maybe 90 miles an hour average. So the inlet exit relationship and ratio, you want to try to optimize as much as possible for that speed. So you'll notice this has, what many people would consider too small of a front end opening. Right here feeds the radiator, and this is only about 4 inches by about 26 inches. And it has a little bit of flex here when you pop it onto the bumper. It gets a little bit bigger, but it's quite small. And that's because it transitions and feeds nicely. You'll notice everything has nice curves to it. This is really important for basically for flow separation. You want to have a nice gentle curves leading up into the radiator. If you have any really abrupt, really harsh curves, the flow of air is going to want to detach from that inside curve. And when it detaches, it becomes turbulent. When it becomes turbulent, you get less flow. So really having a gradual inlet to exit ratio is going to be really important, because you're going to get a lot more cooling efficiency out of it, and you can have smaller front end openings as a result. When you see really massive front end openings, they're not taking advantage of proper airflow through the heat exchangers, and that's going to ultimately create more drag, which requires more horsepower, which is more wear and tear on drivetrain parts, and so on and so forth. The radiator is out of a NASCAR. Pretty expensive unit from C&R. It doesn't look very large, but these are very sophisticated radiators. They're not your standard catalog radiator that you can get. There's a lot of detail to these and how the cores are made that make them massively efficient. So you don't need a very large radiator. I mean, this car runs ice cold. I can be on a 100 degree, 105 degree track day, blasting around as fast as I possibly can, and the coolant temps still never go much above 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So it definitely always stays cool, contrary to people's beliefs that rotors are extremely hot and you just can't keep it cool. Now, I will say a standard 4 rotor is not going to stay cool. They have inherent heat problems related to building 4 rotors. Now, that's not really the 4 rotor's fault per se. It's that you're taking a production-based engine like a 13B and you're modifying it to be 4 rotors long. You're still working around the factory architecture of having coolant enter the front and go to the rear. So I'm going to take this vent out here just so you guys can really see the whole motor setup. And this is the first time I'm really showing this in detail. Some people say, you know, it's like kind of speed secrets, and it is. I mean, this is years and years of development, but I feel like I just want to share some of the work that I've done, and you guys can come along with me and basically understand all of it. So this intake, kind of going on a quick detour. This is the long intake manifold. This is for 440, 445 wheel. It's spec power, which is what I really wanted to focus on because I'm in a power to weight class. So with this car weighing 2,600 pounds, with me in it, it's just under 2,800 pounds. So the most amount of power I'm allowed to have is 450 to the wheels. That puts me in the power to weight category that's legal for the class that I run in. Any more horsepower than that, they dyno you afterwards, and you can get disqualified. So you got to make sure you're actually doing it. This intake just pops off, and that's all it is. This is really long runners, and it has quick release Wiggins clamps for the air trumpets, which I'm a big fan of Wiggins. I use them anytime I can. So here's the engine. This is the slide throttle intake, which if you've watched any of my really old videos, or when I first put it together, you saw me working this thing. But this is a slide throttle, so there is no butterflies in this intake whatsoever. At full throttle, which I'm just going to take these springs off here, at full throttle, it is just an open hole. That is straight into the rotor housing. There is no restriction or turbulence in the way from a butterfly. So that gives you a little more power than a standard butterfly would give you. And contrary, again, to popular opinion, slide throttles are not undrivable. With a proper tune and some methods that I've came up with, this is extremely drivable. For a full peripheral port motor, it is not that hard to manage, honestly. So that's a slide throttle intake. It uses CNC runners that are two-piece that are welded together. It uses the Wiggins clamps right here that pull the intake on and off with just one little motion with your fingers there. That's something that I developed years ago, and now more companies are starting to do it. But I always wanted a peripheral port that didn't have bolts or hose clamps. It was just a real pain in the butt to work with. This you can pull the intake off in literally about 3 minutes, which serviceability on a race car is very important. I use Wiggins throughout. You know, it's Wiggins on the coolant hoses. There's no hose clamps. Everything is hardline. There's a hardline exit for the water pump. Also Wiggins, a little bit of an air separator tank right here. The alternator was relocated using a CNC bracket. So this is a CNC bracket right here that just moves the alternator over. Normally it would bolt on right here to the water pump. And I did that to give clearance for the water hose coming out of the pump right here. This is an external addition. I don't know how easy you can see that. That's an external addition for the water pump. So some of the coolant, a lot of it goes through the engine like standard. And then there's a lot of it also that comes out and flows separately. And this is a design I came up with years ago also. And it's a log. This is the entire log right here that's fed from that pump. And you can see it travel down along here. And what that log does is feed each rotor housing extra coolant. So you have two hard lines branching off of that. This hard line goes down to a hot zone on the rotor housing, and so does this one. And then I have two for the next rotor housing and two for the next rotor housing. So I have 6 external feeds cooling down the engine. Now you gotta do more than just that. Like putting the coolant in there is definitely the first step, but there's more involved to really solving the heat issues, which is a lot of internal reworking on how the flow happens inside the engine. So aside from cooling, I put my ignition coils on top of the engine to make it as compact as possible. These are the ignition coils. They are electromotive units, which is actually a mercury marine based deal. As far as the oil system goes, this is also a log right here that distributes to each of the bearings. So this is the main feed that comes from the oil filter. Another Wiggins clamp there for quick release, follows the main feed into the log, and from the log you got hard lines that feed all the main bearings. So you can see this one goes down right here, that feeds the front bearing, and this is one of the stationary gear bearings, and so on and so forth. Down here is a dry sump pump, which you guys, I explained that in pretty good detail. You got, the oil that comes out returns to the tank, which I have 2 outlets, and then it's kind of dark so it might be hard to see, but these are 2 lines right here, and it goes to a Y adapter, and it goes to a 1 large dash 16, and that returns back to the oil tank.